Hello, I'm Steve Hounsel, Chair of the Ontario Biodiversity Council. I'd like to welcome all of you to the Ontario Biodiversity Summit, Nature-Based Solutions for the 21st Century. And more specifically, I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's webinar, Investing in Natural Infrastructure for Biodiversity and Climate Resilient Communities. This is the 16th and final webinar we have hosted as part of our Summit series, which started in May of this year. Should you be interested, all of our webinars have and will be recorded. You can find them at our website at ontariobiodiversitycouncil.ca. Please do check them out. It is our hope that the summit will connect people from across Ontario and Canada and beyond to talk about, celebrate, and most importantly, take action to protect biodiversity, address climate change, and advance nature-based solutions for a more sustainable future for all. The summit is intended to draw attention to the alarming state of biodiversity loss at multiple scales, including here in Ontario, and the absolute need to bend the curve on biodiversity loss as we work towards a nature-positive world and pursue a new deal of people living in harmony within nature. Remember this: healthy ecosystems sustain healthy people and a healthy economy. It is not the other way around. Biodiversity is the foundation to the pursuit of sustainable development. Indeed, we depend upon it for every moment of our lives. It is also an issue that is intertwined both in causation and in solutions with climate change and the pursuit of sustainable development goals, and hence our focus on nature-based solutions. More importantly, you will be hearing about practical solutions to move us towards a more inspired future for all. Remember, the future is all about choices, the choices that we collectively make. We need to make nature-positive choices. I also want to briefly introduce you to the Ontario Biodiversity Council, now in its 16th year, and the host of this summit. We are a provincial level organization that has come together to achieve the vision and higher order goals and targets set by Ontario's biodiversity strategy, a 10-year strategy that aligns with the Global Strategic Plan for Biological Diversity and its associated IACHI targets. That strategy is a blueprint championed by Council for an ecologically sustainable future for Ontario, its biodiversity, its people, and something that we believe strongly is worth pursuing. We occupy a unique space that links global biodiversity targets with both national efforts and more local implementation efforts. We are working to mainstream as and integrate biodiversity across all sectors and at all scales in an effort to protect what sustains us. It is embodied by the very membership of Council, with some 38 organizations from a broad constituency of industry and industry associations, conservation and environmental groups, natural heritage institutions, academia, Indigenous organizations, and the provincial government, all united around the theme of protecting what sustains us, our biodiversity. And a very special thank you to our sponsors like Ontario Power Generation and Ducks Unlimited Canada, among others. It is because of their collective support that this summit is happening. I also want to respectfully recognize and acknowledge the lands where we reside and from where we work. Since time immemorial, the Indigenous peoples were self-reliant and well provided for through their own ingenuity and use of the gifts of the land, living in harmony with the balance of nature. We, the Ontario Biodiversity Council, acknowledge that the land we meet on and strive to protect is the territory of the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Ojibwe Chippewa peoples, but now is home to many diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. That is also true for the many people participating in our summit who may be residing on unceded lands. I'd also like to recognize the critically important role of our Indigenous peoples in conserving biodiversity as teachers of traditional knowledge, for promoting and enlightening us on ethical space and two-eyed seeing, and as valued members of the Ontario Biodiversity Council. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce you to Catherine Bakos, Director of Climate Finance and Science from the Intact Center on Climate Adaptation, and a very valued member of Council. Catherine is both the session lead and moderator for this afternoon's webinar. Please welcome Catherine.
Thank you so much, Steve, for that lovely introduction, and to all of you joining this webinar today. Very happy to be with you all. As Steve said, my name is Catherine, and I'll be your moderator for today. This webinar, Investing in Natural Infrastructure for Biodiversity and Climate Resilient Communities, is extremely important as it will speak to the need for public sector accounting to be able to reflect the monetary value of natural assets in Canada and the need to invest in natural infrastructure, wetlands, grasslands, forests, to attenuate the effects of extreme weather events, which according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, will only continue to increase in intensity, frequency, and severity, impacting people, biodiversity, and the economy, such as the insurance industry. Today, we're very lucky to be joined by national and international experts who will discuss the benefits of natural infrastructure and profile both existing programs and its application for the design within new urban developments, while highlighting business drivers for investment, policy requirements, and recommended actions to be taken. We're joined by Sage Melser from Finance for Biodiversity, F4B, a research and funding platform focused on the materiality of nature in global financial decision-making. Sage manages content delivery and development across the F4B portfolio. Joanna Acom is Managing Director, Climate Resilient Infrastructure for the Intact Center on Climate Adaptation, which is an applied research center located within the University of Waterloo, helping homeowners, communities, governments, and businesses to identify and reduce risks associated with climate change and extreme weather events, such as flooding, fire, and extreme heat. Bridget Carl is Vice President on Swiss Re's Public Sector Solutions team, forging partnerships with public entities and designing risk transfer solutions to alleviate financial exposures related to extreme weather, health risks, and natural catastrophes. Jennifer Court is Executive Director of the Green Infrastructure Ontario Coalition. Jen brings a breadth of experience in government relations, stakeholder engagement, partnership development, and innovation design to our panel today. Sean Rothman is Provincial Policy Specialist at Ducks Unlimited Canada. Sean has delivered wetland programs in the Lake Simcoe and Georgian Bay watersheds, as well as taking part in industry and government relation programs. Chitra Gowda is Senior Manager, Watershed Planning and Source Protection at Conservation Halton, who brings experience from strategic planning, multi-stakeholder collaboration, and policy development. Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining. Before we dive in, I would like to highlight that this webinar is comprised of two sections. First, each of our speakers will present on their area of interest for approximately 10 minutes each. Once the presentations have concluded, we'll move into the roundtable discussion and audience question and answer portion of the webinar. If you would like to ask a question, please submit your question into the question and answer box and on your screen, and I'll get to it as soon as possible. Please also identify which speaker you're directing your question to ensure your question is properly answered. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce Sage Melser, Finance for Biodiversity, who will be setting the stage for us. As the global communities of public and private finance engage across numerous facets of climate disclosure and reducing carbon footprints, nature and biodiversity are often overshadowed. So Sage will review different methods of integrating nature in financial decision-making from both the public and private sector. Sage, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Catherine. Great to be here, everybody. As mentioned, my name is Sage and I work with F4B, and I am going to be presenting a bit about the work that we do, specifically targeting high risk and high impact efforts to increase materiality of nature and biodiversity in financial decision making. So we cover a very wide range of work, but at our core, we really try to understand the strategic leveraging mechanics of what unlocks meaningful investments into nature and biodiversity. And throughout the rest of this panel, we'll be hearing a lot about some of the opportunities that folks are taking on to create and integrate value of natural assets within Canada. So my role is to actually discuss some of the foundations of what types of tools at the core are being utilized in some of these structures, so we can kind of keep those in the back of our mind and consider throughout the discussion today to see what tools people are using and opportunities for leveraging other aspects as well. So to start off with, let's just talk about what we mean when discussing materiality for nature. So about half of the world's global GDP is very dependent on nature, and it's actually quite hard to understand what a global economy would mean if we didn't have the ability to access the resources and values that nature provided us. And a big reason for that is that finance is not currently taking account a lot of the implicit aspects of value in nature in their financial decision making. So they are therefore not seeing it as material. And that's sort of what we mean when we talk about those things. So things like investment impacts on the environment, future generations, the value and services provided by natural assets. A lot of what we'll be discussing today currently isn't recognized to what I think a lot of people see as very important in the financial system. So the challenge is really to understand what the leverage points are to create and define this materiality within finance. So within our work, we approach it from what we say are kind of three key pillars that define materiality in different sectors. So financial institutions, of course, are a main player because they really want to understand the disclosure, accounting mechanisms, the governance, and just business operations that help align nature positivity within their business operations. And then public engagement is also crucial because, like the private sector, governments have their own investments and assets within their portfolios, but they also have the ability to use policy incentives to trigger necessary behavior and shift change. And then the third lens is the legal system, which is quite interesting because I think this has been attracting a lot of attention recently, and the roles for regulatory processes to actually provide these standardized methodologies across the board to help actually institutionalize this operational behavior, both in the government lens and in the financial institution lens. So you can see that all of these things are all very important, and they are almost codependent and relate to each other quite closely and are very important in assigning the value of nature. So as I kind of move forward in my presentation, I'll talk really briefly about some examples of each of these, and then at the end we'll sort of tie together what these very large and abstract ideas actually mean in the context of Canada and our discussion today. So first, the opportunities of assigning value within the financial community. I think that more and more often the finance community is recognizing the very urgent and important need to understand what the risks of degradation and loss to nature and biodiversity means to their businesses and investments in terms of vulnerability and resiliency of operations in the future. So the key is to make sure that we are recognizing that value and doing it strategically and systematically, but not operating on some of the decadal timescales that we've gotten to in the carbon argument. And while those developments have been positive, we need to make sure that we're moving quickly to solve the nature and biodiversity agenda. So at FRB, for example, we've been working a lot with initiatives like the Task Force of Nature-Related Financial Disclosure to really get at a lot of those core challenges that really are going to, again, unlock large-scale investments and movement into this space. So things like how you're assigning value, how that value can be standardized across markets, what the data needs are. And as these things start to come forward and as there's larger demand from the global financial sector, what's interesting is we start to see that spill over into some of those other pillars, right? So for instance, in the global governmental support within national jurisdictions calls for increased data quality and quantity and some of those policy levers to actually incentivize understanding of how they can actually support the integration of some of these aspects into the financial system. So along that same vein, if we start talking about the government and the public finance aspect, they also have a lot that they can do with the assets and investments they have to actually communicate nature value. So a great example in sort of the more recent current events are the greening of the stimulus packages that have been coming out in response to the COVID pandemic. A lot of countries have done a lot of really exciting and progressive work of trying to direct those investments into areas that will actually allow to support greener investments, things like natural infrastructure or supporting more nature positive activities. But if you actually look at the comprehensive analytics of these policies in the graph on the left, we can actually see that either new or incumbent policies actually can almost detract or negate some of the investments that are being made, meaning that essentially it lowers that total index of positive potential outcomes. So when you're talking about these things in terms of the total strategic integrated policies and how they are actually putting forth some of these investments, you have movements in the right direction, which is fantastic, but it is also recognizing how you are extending that value across the landscape of your financial investments. And in addition, on the flip side of the same coin, I won't get into the detail because I do not have the time nor PhD to talk about it in sufficient detail, but it's very important to recognize the importance of capturing these types of natural value and assets in the conversation surrounding national debt markets, for example. And this is something that FRB is also very particularly interested in, and how we can design mechanisms that support greening sovereign debt, for example, or creating performance bonds that are tangibly attached to nature. And with this, the final pillar that we actively engage on is the litigation aspect. Oops, let me see if I can go back. Perfect. Is the litigation and regulation aspect. So as mentioned, there's a lot of attention, I think, that's being paid to this area right now, which is quite exciting, with things like shareholders not having their interests represented properly within the companies they invest in, human rights or financial crime being intertwined with losses of nature, illegal deforestation, things like that. And in the past, we've seen a lot of times, you know, there's a scandal that comes forward, these institutions might be slapped with a fine, but in the large scheme of things, they are making significantly more amounts of money than those fines actually entail. But as data and accounting, disclosure, all of these policy incentives and asset valuation that's starting to come down the pike in relation to the other two pillars that we just discussed, we're starting to see some real precedents of engaging some of this regulatory pillar and actually helping assign uniform standardized value and approaches to the valuation of these assets. And what's interesting is, I think one might initially say, well, there's no way business would buy into this, or why the financial sector would actually support something like this. But through our work, we engage a lot with a lot of different stakeholders in the financial institution space, the governmental space, and a lot of them actually surprisingly said this is just inherently good business, because what's great is if we have a way of standardizing the competitive field in terms of playing in these markets, we no longer have to worry about some of this value not actually being, you know, tangibly accounted for in some of the just standardized regulations and how global markets function in terms of the financial flows and global supply chains. So this is something that is also actually quite compelling to think about when we're discussing ways where we can create value for our markets, not just with the financial institutions or with the public sector specifically. So to kind of summarize, because that was a lot, it was very abstract and very much at a 30,000-foot level, of bringing it back to kind of what does it mean for the purposes of this conversation for valuing natural assets in Canada. And from my perspective, it has everything to do with this conversation, because Canada is incredibly rich in natural assets, is very diverse, and because of all of these pillars we've discussed and the work that's being done, there's a lot of really promising opportunity that these pieces can be played strategically and leveraged to make Canada the global leader in this space that it absolutely could be. So I think moving forward in this presentation, as we hear from other panelists, hearing how they are taking their corner of the nature materiality narrative and seeing what leverages they're using across these pillars, and in the discussion talking about opportunities to derive support from each other and other sectors of the nature value chain as well. So with that, thank you very much, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Sage. I really appreciate that. The increased recognition of utilizing nature to better align global financial markets and biodiversity conservation is so important. Really happy that you're able to cover that, as well as the different methods of integrating nature into financial decision-making throughout your presentation. So thank you so much. Next, I'd like to turn to Joanna Acom, Intact Center on Climate Adaptation, who will be discussing integrating natural assets into municipal planning and finances, and how accounting and valuing for natural assets is an integral part of asset management planning, and how these assets should be included in financial statements. So Joanna, over to you.
Thanks so much, Catherine. And I think this presentation will hopefully flow really well from Sage's introduction to the subject. I'm particularly drawing on the need for kind of standardized accounting and disclosure of natural assets. Next slide. Thanks. So, so my presentation, I'll be looking at how natural assets are being integrated into municipal planning and finances by kind of leading municipalities who are taking action and kind of, you know, there's no regulation to make them do this, but people are recognizing the value of natural assets and they want to integrate them in their planning processes. Next slide. So, so I'm going to be talking about natural assets, and I just wanted to clear up a little bit of understanding about natural or green infrastructure. So in this context, I'll be talking about intact ecosystems, wetlands, rivers, forests, coastal marshes, and other naturally occurring systems. And this can be seen as a subset of green infrastructure, which may also include enhanced assets or engineered assets, which kind of mimic some of the processes of natural processes, but are actually engineered in terms of their design. So I just wanted to clear up what I'm talking about when I'm talking about natural assets. Next slide, please. So I think the narrative in Canada has natural assets are being seen more and more as infrastructure. So we see the recent launch in the budget of the Natural Infrastructure Fund, so 200 million over 3 years to being funded from Infrastructure Canada to establish the Natural Infrastructure Fund. So I think the terminology and the fact that this is coming from Infrastructure Canada does kind of signify a recognition that natural assets also play a role alongside our built assets. There's also the National Infrastructure Assessment. So basically the Government of Canada has launched the National Infrastructure Assessment and consulted on it. And the most recent publication indicates that natural infrastructure will be included in that assessment, which is also, you know, would be a big thing for Canada to look at that nationally. So I think at the federal level, natural assets are being viewed as infrastructure, but obviously infrastructure funding in terms of built infrastructure far outstrips what is being used to fund natural infrastructure at present, but it's a start. Next slide, please. So natural infrastructure or natural assets are so important because they provide us ecosystem goods and services that we can divide into provisioning, regulation, support, and cultural services. And these services are just not provided by grey infrastructure. And often we focus on, we're looking at climate adaptation. So we'll look at flooding and erosion control or temperature control. Also there's biodiversity and habitats, carbon sequestration, but these are just some of the services. So there's a whole suite of services that nature provides that provides to communities. Ultimately, these services are a benefit to people. So natural assets are basically underpinning our existence, as Steve said in the introduction. And another thing that I wanted to share was this idea that natural assets actually provide the superstructure within which our built infrastructure is based. So there's all kinds of systems and services going on around us that are provided by nature, and we are then part of that, and we draw on those benefits. So this idea of superstructure, which I find very interesting and compelling. The next slide, please. So how is natural infrastructure being valued in Canada? So basically the discipline of environmental economics is really taking off kind of worldwide. I would say there's more and more countries looking at natural capital accounting and actually valuing the services that natural infrastructure provides. And this, I'm not going to go through this table in detail, but just so that you have an idea of some of the the values that are being provided for just some of the services that are being provided across Canada. So we see studies in British Columbia, Quebec, Ontario, New Brunswick, and the National Capital Region. So these kind of studies are really being taken on by municipalities that really want to know the value of these services so that they can integrate them into their urban planning and asset management systems. Next slide, please. So managing assets, natural assets in communities, some research that the Intech Center did previously, we kind of came up with a hierarchy of effectiveness or kind of efficiency. So the first being to protect what you have, so not to preserve those natural assets that you have and are still existing. Then to restore what you've lost and build only what you must. So the idea being that we can stop further decline, but actually in order to improve ecosystem services and improve natural assets, then we will need to restore what we've lost as well. And then I think a step on from that is integrating these natural assets into municipal asset management planning. And we work very closely with the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative, who are undertaking this work, which is basically asset management planning, but for natural assets. So it involves kind of inventorying, looking at the condition of your assets, looking at what will be required in the future, and then planning for spending and management of those assets in the long term. So it's kind of a principle of asset management planning is actually being undertaken by a lot of municipalities. It's kind of a key initiative to better plan in the future, but we can also include natural assets in that process. Next slide, please. So in Canada, over the last 10 years, we've seen several municipal scale initiatives to inventory and value natural infrastructure. And this is looking at different functions and up to the basin scale now. We see practical examples of municipalities like Gibson's that are actively have incorporated their natural assets into asset management planning. And you can see on this slide, there's a wide list of kind of communities that have taken this on already. However, it's funded as an additional activity that's undertaken by forward-thinking municipalities, NGOs, research groups, and is not currently reflected in their financial reporting. And the key challenge is to mainstream management and restoration of natural assets as a function of what we would do anyway. So next slide, please. So one of the things that we have been working on is looking at options to recognize the value of natural assets that have been valued already by municipalities in their financial statements. Actually, at the moment, inherited natural assets are explicitly excluded from financial statements. And proposed revisions by the Public Sector Accounting Board would actually continue this exclusion at present. So there was a response to a consultation on the revision of the conceptual framework that was signed by 69 organizations that support the ability to include natural assets. And we aim to basically, crack on with a working group to start getting consistency around how we can do this as part of financial statements or notes on financial statements. And this initiative was supported by GRI, IBC, FCM, and several Ontario municipalities, including the City of Toronto, Mississauga, Brampton, and Vaughan. Next slide, please. And I think the added impetus in Ontario to really get a grip on managing our natural assets and appreciating their value is that the regulation on asset management in Ontario will require municipalities to include green infrastructure assets in their asset management planning by July 2023. So in order to comply with this regulation, we need to get moving on characterizing and valuing our natural assets so that we can plan the management in the future. Next slide. And that's the end. I know. So 3 takeaways. So I think the first is that natural assets are infrastructure and are being managed as such by certain communities. and that valuing the benefits typically makes a clear economic case for using and protecting natural infrastructure, but that this value is currently not reflected in our financial statements. And Ontario municipalities will need to integrate natural assets into asset management planning by 2023.
Thank you so much, Joanna. That was a very informative presentation. The way you highlighted the importance of natural infrastructure while describing how municipalities are already accounting for and valuing for their natural assets was extremely helpful and a great template for others to follow suit. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Up next, we have Bridget Carl, Swiss Re, who will discuss the role of natural assets in reducing extreme weather exposures and how revenue can be added to communities, while innovative insurance solutions can make natural assets more financially resilient. Bridget, the floor is all yours.
Hi, thanks so much, Catherine. And it's great to go after Joanna and Sage, who I've had the pleasure of working with already, and I think they set the table very nicely. So great to be here and part of this important conversation. And I'll bring the insurance and reinsurance angle to this discussion, how we are increasingly valuing and supporting the important role that nature-based solutions play in our economies and environments. I think, do I have control of the slides, or did that change? It was working before. Oh, great. Oh no, I don't have control, so I'm not sure who's controlling. But if you don't mind going to the next slide, which outlines a little bit and speaks to the threat that you know, Joanna and Sage mentioned, and that we're all familiar with, that our natural assets are at risk, are under enormous threat with climate change, biodiversity loss, ecosystem degradation. We know that these sustainability challenges are impacting us at a greater and faster pace, and demands our attention and action. And if you'll, on the next slide, one of the things that Swiss Re has done is to demonstrate and put some value on at a global level the vital role that natural assets play in not only reducing some of the threats of extreme weather, beautifying our communities, but also contributing to our economies and value. So, for example, you have here that the economic value provided by coral reefs through tourism-related activities alone is 36 billion globally. And on the next one, as here the estimated damage of coral reefs against storms was valued on the last slide as well. I don't have the numbers memorized, but you can see here the Swiss Re did that to just analyze several examples and showcase the importance that are, you know, in our discussions with financial planning and insurance, how much value we're attributing to these assets and how much we're getting from them. And once, you know, there is an actual value to place against that, that helps to elevate the importance and allow decision makers to better understand and ideally pay attention to the value we're getting from these natural assets. On the next slide, you know, I think one of the things we inherently know is that we know we need to protect biodiversity for our economies to ensure a sustainable future. But if we can actually place a value on these natural assets, that is where it becomes very clear to us, and the value we're getting from not only societal benefits to communities, but also in reducing the risk and mitigating the damages from natural disasters and extreme weather events, as well as providing an important fight against climate change, as natural assets help to capture carbon and reduce elements of sea level rise, warming temperatures, and the list goes on and on. On the next slide, I talk a little bit about how Swiss Re is thinking of this and why an insurer would care about this type of thing. And Swiss Re, for those who are not familiar with us, Swiss Re is the world's largest reinsurer. And we see the impacts of climate change on our balance sheet every day. And we've been seeing this for decades. Actually, Swiss Re's been writing about climate change since the 70s. And we saw it on our balance sheet because the impacts of extreme weather, the frequency of them, the severity of them, of natural catastrophe events have been going up and up over the years. And so there's really no denying it. The numbers don't lie when you look at it. And we know that natural assets have a real role to play here. And if we lose that protection value that nature provides us, those losses will continue to go up. And so outlined here on the right hand of the slide, you can see that, you know, how we're thinking of it in kind of three ways. Well, what is the role that insurance has to play in protecting our natural assets? One is protecting the natural asset itself. And that, you know, could be similar the way you'd think about a large building or a bridge. You wouldn't want to have one of those major natural assets without having insurance tied to it, as well as solutions that protect the revenue derived from that natural asset. We know communities and economies depend on the revenue derived from natural assets, and so we can protect that so that if you know, an event occurs where people can't visit the natural asset like coral reefs or certain communities, that revenue is protected. As well as the third way, which is enabling and de-risking nature-based construction. So this similarly, you know, I often like to say, like, think about this as you would the regular world and the way that insurance shows up in our lives and our communities. And it's the same way we should be thinking about it for natural assets, given the enormous and tremendous role that we know that it plays in our lives and our economies, as Joanna outlined really nicely in Canada as well. So on the next slide, I laid out a little bit how this works. How can insurance help? So, you know, considering the role that all have to play, so this includes businesses, investors, governments, you know, all are impacted by natural assets and should be, you know, have a seat at the table. And then how does one go about designing some of these solutions? So the first step here on the right side is to identify the asset that needs protection. The second is understanding the risks or the concerns that you have. What do you want to protect it from? Then third, determining the payout needs. How much is needed to respond or repair after a major event? And then who are the beneficiaries? So this often with natural assets ends up being a public-private partnership, because with nature, you often have many different types of stakeholders involved, but then that would, you know, the final step is determining who's going to own the product and own the solution. And if you'll go one more down, I put here, this is something that, yep, on the next slide, outlined how Swiss Re's institute actually developed what we're calling a biodiversity and ecosystem index to help the decision-making process better understand the risks. And this tool is actually embedded already in our CatNet tool, which is a tool that you can type in a zip code and have a clear picture of how that area is at risk to major events like floods, earthquakes, hurricanes. And then now overlaying that on top is, well, what is the risk to natural assets and how much will that impact that community? So this is a really nice tool that helps in the decision-making process and conversations around nature-based insurance solutions. And then on the next slide, I've outlined, wanted to share a few case studies here to see, well, where has this been done and how this might be able to be applied in Canada. And so the first case study here was in Scandinavia, where they have valuable timber forests that are at risk of being destroyed. So the trees may fall for a number of reasons, from severe winter storms, and that has as many impacts on communities, from bringing down power lines and business interruption, but also could end up releasing some of that carbon that has been sequestered. And so they wanted an insurance solution to protect the value that the forests bring and reduce the financial volatility that is associated with, if the trees do fall, where's the budget coming from to rebuild and restore those forests? And so this is one example of how insurance has added value and played a role in nature and protecting it. On the next slide, I outlined where my colleagues in the Netherlands designed a nature-based insurance solution. So this was actually a major natural construction project that the government of the Netherlands created to protect the island of Texel from sea level rise. And so it was this major sand dune project, and they wanted to implement what we call a construction all risk policy, which protected the project from any sort of damages or extreme weather events that might occur while the construction is going on, and also liabilities and protecting it, that make sure it happens on time and on budget. And so all that investment money that was put into this tremendous project was protected, and if something went wrong, they wouldn't have to start from scratch with figuring out how to finance it, but the insurance policy would step in and protect it. The third example on the next slide is quite famous now. I think it's caught a lot of attention. It was on the front page of the New York Times several months ago, and so maybe some folks are familiar with this one. But this was put together by Swiss Re, the Nature Conservancy, and others down in Mexico. What they recognized that the coral reefs off of Quintana Roo were not only under tremendous threat because of climate change, too much tourism, etc., but hurricanes were also impacting the coral reef itself. And the coral reef was inherently providing a ton of protection for the coastline and the many hotels and tourism industry that's up on the shore, because coral reefs actually reduce the wave attenuation from coming on shore. And so this was a really great partnership that was put in place a few years ago, and they realized, we want to protect the coral reef. We get so much value out of them, and beyond tourism, but also protecting us from hurricanes itself. And so we designed a hurricane insurance coverage that actually paid out at the end of last year, I think approximately $800,000. Which the public-private partnership entity received the funding very quickly after the storm, so that they could then actually deploy what they called reef brigades, which was a team of divers who went down to collect and mend the broken coral, which we learned is really a time-sensitive thing. So it was important that the insurance policy was designed very quickly, so they could have the funding and get down there to repair ASAP. And on the next slide, I outlined actually an illustrative coverage for Canada. This is not something that is in place, but is something that actually I've worked with Sage for a number of months on as well, and as well as some other folks that are on this call. And this is discussion that's been happening around Ottawa, and how the region's wetlands are not always front and center in the decision-making process when considering land use and development. But folks there have been concerned for a while about the state of the wetlands, and knowing that they provide not only rich biodiversity and clean air, clean water benefits, but also are protecting a city that's already vulnerable from flooding. And so actually, the University of Waterloo did a study that showed that leaving the wetlands intact can reduce the financial costs of floods by up to 38%. And so a potential nature-based insurance solution that we think could add a lot of value to the city is really forging the connection between the flood mitigation, in other words, wetland protection, as well as the flood response efforts. And so you could design a flood parametric insurance cover that would provide flexible funding for response efforts to the city or surrounding regions for whatever they deem necessary after a major flood event, while also incorporating the value of the wetlands. So you have that clear economic value on the wetlands, so that it's inherently embedded in decision-making processes around emergency management and as well as flood resilience measures. And so again, this is not something that's in place yet, but I think it's a really interesting conversation to be had, and one that could probably be applicable in many parts of Canada, given the significant flood risks. And on the next slide, I just wanted to share a snapshot of sample of partners and collaborations that are underway to grow these nature-based insurance solutions globally. We know that nature and natural assets provide society with an enormous amount of value, and insurance has a really nice role to play because we want to protect and make those investments more resilient over time. So thanks so much for your time here today, and look forward to hearing the other speakers and discussing later.
Thanks so much, Bridget, especially for highlighting the key steps to implement insurance solutions and how governments and public entities can use insurance to incentivize better behaviors. The case studies you provided were really informative too. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Up next, we have Jennifer Court from Green Infrastructure Ontario, who will talk about the importance of using infrastructure language and recognizing the importance of incorporating green infrastructure assets into municipal asset management plans. Jen, over to you.
Thanks so much, Catherine. Really excited to be with everyone here today. So I'm going to provide a bit of an overview of the ways that we work at GEO to make a case for green infrastructure. So first of all, I'd like to introduce GEO to those of you who may not be familiar with us. The Green Infrastructure Ontario Coalition, or GEO, is an alliance of organizations that share a common vision for a healthy green Ontario, where the multiple economic, social, environmental, and health benefits of green infrastructure are fully realized. So essentially, we're aiming to make green infrastructure the new normal. We were founded in 2009, and we're guided by a steering committee that represents the various facets of the sector. You can see our current members on the right of this slide. We also have a general membership of interested stakeholders. And our activities fall into two main categories. So the first is government relations, including direct advocacy, as well as comments and feedback on proposed policy. So it's great to have had Joanna go ahead, because she's teed up a lot of the content. So we're very involved in advocating for funding, so things like the Natural Infrastructure Fund. Really incorporated a lot of the feedback that we and others had been putting forward to Infrastructure Canada. Very interested in the outcomes of the National Infrastructure Assessment. And then here in Ontario, the OREG 58817, the Asset Management Reg, which I'll speak about. The other bucket is communication and knowledge sharing, so presentations like this one, publications, workshops, webinars, as well as our monthly newsletter. On the communication and knowledge sharing side, one of our key activities is producing and sharing reports that advance knowledge in the green infrastructure sector and engage diverse stakeholders across the sector. So this slide provides a bit of a snapshot of our publications and research projects from our first ever report, which makes the case for green infrastructure in Ontario, as well as our suite of resources related to Ontario's urban forests. Green Infrastructure Guide for Small Cities, Towns, and Rural Communities, which breaks down green infrastructure typologies and planning zones. The State of Large Parks in Ontario's Golden Horseshoe, which we're currently in the midst of developing a sequel to, and our economic impact assessment of the green infrastructure sector in Ontario, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. We've also been increasingly focused on supporting municipalities in their work to protect and implement green infrastructure, and have just launched a new training series focused on incorporating green infrastructure into asset management planning. So I'm going to talk more about why that's so important to us. Details about all of these publications and projects are on GEO's website. So typically now I go into a description of green infrastructure so that we're already on the same page. Joanna did a great job of queuing this up. So I am going to talk about the full sort of umbrella of green infrastructure, even though we are focusing on natural infrastructure here today. So GEO's definition of green infrastructure is on the screen. Real focus on co-benefits, natural vegetative systems, and green technologies. So encompassing both the natural and human-made solutions. So the reason that we think it's important to sort of disambiguate this language is that federally, the language around green infrastructure is used much more broadly. So their definition includes some things that we don't include, like renewable energy, EV charging, and conventional wastewater treatment. And so often when we're speaking in that context, I will use the language natural infrastructure. However, that definition can also include what they refer to as sort of hybrid solutions, which are we refer to as enhanced and engineered, as Joanna described. Oops. And so we've recently developed this infographic that helps to clarify some of these relationships. So green infrastructure is the big umbrella, natural infrastructure on the natural side, nature-based solutions or nature-based climate solutions falls under there as well. So essentially we mean living green infrastructure from natural systems, you can see the different types of assets listed here, to enhanced and engineered assets. And as you can see from the infographic, we do think it's really important to recognize green infrastructure as assets and to use infrastructure language whenever possible. Using this language is important to us because it puts green infrastructure assets on a level playing field with gray infrastructure. Infrastructure is a term that's used to describe the basic structures that serve a city and its residents, but nature is not traditionally included in this definition. Green infrastructure, however, does provide services. It serves many important purposes and provides a wide range of benefits. Joanna really helpfully listed those all in her presentation, so I won't go into detail. But essentially our aim is to have natural features viewed as equals to things like roads, bridges, etc., other traditionally built structures, with a focus on both the conservation of existing assets as well as restoration and bringing green infrastructure back into developed areas. So inventorying and valuing these assets is also important, not to commodify them, but to ensure that they are accounted for in plans and that they're eligible for provincial and federal funding, that they're factored into municipal planning and operations, and that the full range of services that they provide is taken into account. To support this goal, GEO has been advocating for green infrastructure language in a variety of places, starting with the Ontario Provincial Policy Statement. We were able to successfully get a definition that's very close to ours included in that statement in 2014 that carried through to the recently revised version in 2020. And that's important because it then informs a number of other municipal policies. We were also really excited to work with the government to have green infrastructure included in the asset management regulation that Joanna also mentioned, OREG 58817, which meaningfully includes green infrastructure and calls for green infrastructure assets to be incorporated into asset management plans. Good news, the deadline was actually extended to 2024, so buys municipalities a little bit more time, but you know, it is quite a process, and we do think that municipalities should be focusing on this now, which is why we've worked to support them through things like our training series. And so meaningfully incorporating green infrastructure and green infrastructure assets into municipal plans and policies is really key to operationalizing green infrastructure across a municipality and realizing the many benefits and services that green infrastructure can provide. So while we do really think that green infrastructure belongs everywhere, we do have a particular focus on the asset management planning process. Understanding what assets are currently owned by a municipality, their condition, the level of service that they provide, and all of those sort of early stage works then lays the groundwork for developing a life cycle management plan, understanding risks, and developing a solid financial strategy, which allows a municipality to better plan for not just the management of current assets, but also investment in additional green infrastructure assets. And then, as I mentioned, many funding programs also require that assets be included in an asset management plan in order to be eligible to receive additional funding. I jumped ahead. Now I'm going to talk briefly about the results of our economic impact assessment of the green infrastructure sector in Ontario, which is another way that we have worked to quantify the value and impact of green infrastructure. So this first of its kind study was commissioned by GEO, funded by the Greenbelt Foundation with additional financial support from Landscape Ontario, and the assessment was prepared by the Delphi Group. The goal of the study was to gain an understanding of the full scope of green infrastructure in Ontario as a sector, and more broadly to be able to show that green infrastructure is in fact a robust sector that contributes to the provincial economy. So first it was necessary to define the subsectors that contribute, as well as the activity within these sectors. Then Delphi completed an assessment of the economic contribution of the sector, and finally estimated the growth potential based on 2 scenarios. A key challenge in starting the project is that the green infrastructure sector is not recognized as a sector provincially or federally, in that it's not sort of a neatly bundled sector that you can look up in the StatsCan analysis, for example. So there was some work to be done to figure out what needed to be included in the analysis. And this work started with GEO's definition of green infrastructure. The challenge was to ensure that all facets of the sector and the activity within them were included, but that no data was duplicated. In order to do that, 7 key subsectors were defined, which are listed on the slide. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read them, but they're here for you. And after defining that scope, Delphi was able to complete the assessment. So on to the detailed findings of the study. Based on the most recent data available from 2018, it's estimated that Ontario's green infrastructure sector was responsible for generating $8.3 billion in gross domestic product, GDP, and employing over 122,000 people. Those are both including the indirect and induced impacts. In order to put that into a little bit of context, we asked Delphi to look at the next closest official sector, so those that are defined within the province. So you can see that here. Note that for these comparisons, we're looking at the direct numbers. But then to add a little bit more context, and where this gets really interesting for me is in the jobs comparisons. So you can see here, compared to those same sectors, the green infrastructure sector contributes significantly more jobs. It is, in fact, more than all 3 of those sectors combined. So looking a little bit further, so again, factoring in indirect and induced impacts, the number is over 122,000, which aligns just behind the real estate sector here in Ontario, which employs an estimated 166,000. Another interesting comparison that we looked at was to Canada's auto industry. You hear a lot about the auto industry, supports for the auto industry, how important it is to our economy. So for a little bit of additional context, that sector employs 188,000 people across Canada, compared to those numbers in Ontario. So for me, that helped to really understand the significant impact of the sector and also to be able to speak about that impact, most importantly. I'm not going to read this slide in detail, but just wanted to provide a bit of a snapshot. The other great thing about those jobs numbers is that it's a really wide range of jobs across all of those seven subsectors, and spans from laborers to skilled trades to professional services and everything in between. And there are a number of different entry points and opportunities for people to join the sector. Some other notable findings are that the supply chain for the green infrastructure sector is very local. Investment in the sector stays within the province and often within the immediate community where the investment is made. As I mentioned, there's a wide range of jobs. There's also an incredibly strong return on investment, particularly when it comes to projects relating to climate resilience and disaster risk, specifically those related to flooding. And we also looked at the growth potential of the sector over the next 10 years. So in order to look at that potential, we looked at two scenarios, business as usual, and then a stretch scenario. So even under the business as usual growth trends, the sector is projected to grow by 22%. However, the stretch scenario, which factors in increased investment that brings natural infrastructure onto more of a level playing field, but baby steps, so looking at 15% of infrastructure spending dedicated to natural and green infrastructure, as well as supportive policy, that number jumps to 73%. So we've been really excited to have these results to be able to share with decision makers who are making investment decisions and have this report as a tool to promote the sector. So a few key takeaways: green infrastructure is win-win-win, creates good local jobs, supports climate and flood resilience, as well as biodiversity, and provides a variety of additional physical and mental health benefits. And it really presents a transformative economic sector opportunity for Ontario as well as for Canada, but we need more reliable investment. And so this is why we're really excited to have this report to use as a tool when we're encouraging people to make that type of investment. So this report, as well as the others that I mentioned, are on GEO's website. And yeah, really excited to have both that and our work at the municipal level to help make the case for green infrastructure and support decision makers in valuing and investing in green infrastructure to realize our vision of making green infrastructure the new normal. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Jen. I found the high-level results from GEO's economic impact assessment extremely informative and could see how you can make a business case for investment in green infrastructure. So thanks so much for providing your insights. Next, we have Sean Rothman from Ducks Unlimited Canada, who will focus on the state of wetlands in Ontario and will build the case for wetlands as natural infrastructure, specifically focusing on municipal conservation of wetlands for flood resiliency. Sean, over to you.
Thanks, Catherine, and good afternoon, everybody. Thanks to OBC for having me here today. Make sure my slides are working. So just to introduce Ducks quickly, in Ontario, we've been working here since 1974, across Canada since 1938. In Ontario, we've conserved nearly 1 million acres of wetlands, as well as the associated habitats of wetlands like grasslands and forests, upland forests. We work with landowners, First Nations, industry and government to implement wetland conservation projects, which includes a mix of wetland restoration, stewardship, and management. So really a vision that we have for a climate resilient Ontario is really building around this natural infrastructure vision and a strategy that looks at not only protecting key natural heritage features, but identifying opportunities to restore connectivity across the landscape and improve climate resiliency. We want to see natural infrastructure strategy inform planning so that these opportunities to restore connectivity and improve resiliency are not lost as communities grow. And we want to see natural infrastructure recognized as an asset that complements traditional infrastructure and is included in asset inventories and management plans. And as we've heard of today, this will be a big part of municipalities' planning process as they move forward. So that's good. So the historic loss of wetlands, coupled with climate change impacts, really shows the importance for conserving wetlands and restoring and creating wetlands to mitigate impacts. We've estimated that across Southern Ontario, there's been more than 70% of wetlands lost since European settlement via land conversion due to agriculture, residential, commercial, and industrial development. And we're really starting to see the importance that wetlands play and the function that wetlands play on the landscape and how critical it is to wildlife and biodiversity. And not only that, but critical to human systems in terms of phosphorus and nitrogen uptake for water quality, flood attenuation benefits for flood control, and areas of green space for recreation. So wanted to highlight some recent investments in natural infrastructure that we have been a part of. In 2017, we successfully engaged Infrastructure Canada along with MNRF on infrastructure funding for wetland restoration in the Lake Erie watershed. That was a very successful program, and we implemented nearly 100 wetland projects with that funding in 2017. In 2019, the Investing in Canada Infrastructure Program was announced. That really drove a lot of our current municipal outreach on engaging municipalities on accessing this infrastructure funding, which had a green stream component to it. The green stream, the first green stream component in Ontario was more focused on hard infrastructure projects with green outcomes. The second stream of green stream was slated for later in 2020, but after COVID hit, it was repurposed by the feds as the COVID Resilience Infrastructure Fund. And we helped facilitate a project that's underway right now down in Durham Region and Ajax, who have used some of that money that they received via this COVID Resilience Fund towards a wetland project that will address flooding and water quality issues in Ajax. And Ducks Unlimited has been successful with the MECP Wetlands Partnership Program, which was recently announced last year. We are delivering the first year of that project, which is going to give meaningful scale to wetland restoration here in Ontario. It's the first of a 5-year program. And as was mentioned before, there's a federal natural infrastructure fund that was announced, $200 million over 3 years beginning this year. We produced a report recently on called the Municipal Conservation of Wetlands for Flood Resiliency, helping to build the case for wetlands as natural infrastructure. Just highlight a couple of things from this report, and if anyone's interested in accessing it, please reach out to me. I can provide that to you. Really, the report looked at how wetlands are being incorporated in municipal planning, whether they're conducting cost-benefit analysis around that, estimating flood services of wetlands, monetizing the flood services of value of wetlands, and then also quantifying the co-benefits of natural infrastructure. So we saw a lot of key takeaways from this research. It suggested that there's a growing understanding of flood mitigation benefits of wetlands, but it's not really being fully translated into actions to mitigate flood risk. There are some barriers to this. The regulatory requirements, as has been mentioned with the asset management planning, is driving an increase in potential wetland protection and restoration. And overall, really the suggestion was that wetlands as natural infrastructure have the ability to complement traditional gray infrastructure in terms of cost savings and life cycle costs. So I sort of talked about some key findings there. Some deterrents that were brought out in this report, which was there was some primary research done there of interviewing municipalities and conservation authorities on their thoughts on this. Organizational silos, lack of awareness across departments, lack of a business case for incorporating wetlands into municipal planning, pressure from development community, lack of support from municipal engineering groups, and other funding issues were some of the key barriers that was brought out there. So again, if you're interested in this report, I can definitely pass that along to you. What I wanted to talk about now was some recent tool that we've been developing, a wetland targeting tool, looking at identifying best bet wetland restoration opportunities on the Ontario landscape. So we sort of kicked this off by engaging with University GIS grad program that helped us develop the bones of this project. They provided a literature review as well as what other data was being used in other tools similar to this and how we can incorporate it into the Ontario landscape. So we the result of it that we've been developing based the tool on 6 criteria, GIS layers that could help inform landscape opportunities. They used layers such as hydric soils, soil drainage layers for Ontario, saturation index, distance to existing water courses, distance to existing wetlands, and land cover. And these criteria were then weighted and overlaid in an ArcMap program that we have been developing and engaging with municipalities on over the last few months to get more feedback on the criteria of the tools, how it's being used, and also engaging with them on how we could incorporate other layers to help refine these wetland opportunities, such as public land layers, existing natural heritage system layers or planning. And so we continue to do that with municipalities as an outreach tool, is utilizing this GIS tool to engage them with. So not only talking about potential funding opportunities, but trying to build a strategic case for where we could put wetlands on the ground. Yeah, and so I guess really to summarize, we are trying to build scale for wetland restoration across southern Ontario. We are looking at leveraging natural infrastructure funding for wetland restoration and management projects. We're supporting climate change science and the science around the other values of wetlands, and pushing government for stronger wetland protections and investments in wetlands as natural infrastructure. So I'll leave it there, and looking forward to questions from everyone here. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Sean. I really appreciated how your presentation focused on municipal conservation of wetlands for flood resiliency, specifically because flooding is one of the highest costs to Canadians because of extreme weather. So thanks so much for your insights. Last but not least, we have Chitra Gowda from Conservation Halton. Chitra will discuss watershed-based management of natural resources that support climate change resiliency. Chitra, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Catherine. There we go. All right, thank you. So that was a very informative suite of presentations ahead of me. So I'm going to try to follow suit and match that those very informative presentations. And I'm going to be talking about watershed-based natural asset management to support climate resiliency in Ontario. I just wanted to take a step back and talk about conservation authorities in Ontario. So more than 90% of Ontario's population lives within an area that is called a watershed and managed by a conservation authority. The conservation authorities, there are 36 of them across Ontario, and the network umbrella organization is Conservation Ontario. I just want to acknowledge my colleague Joanne Jodke from Conservation Ontario with some of the content on the slide. The conservation authorities, including the one that I work at, which is Conservation Halton, we function on a watershed basis. So I'm sure all of us here are aware of it, but just to reiterate, the watershed spans political boundaries and brings together multiple stakeholders on a very large basis to achieve shared common goals. And a watershed, simply put, is an area of land where all of the water eventually drains to one water body. It could be, in our case, Lake Ontario, or a river, or so on. And the approach followed by Ontario's conservation authorities is called integrated watershed management, sometimes also called simply watershed management. And this helps bring together all of the considerations, human activities, natural resource management, with the considerations of social, economic, and environmental interests, which also helps support the sustainable use of our natural resources. So again, to reiterate, Conservation Halton is a member of Conservation Ontario, which is the network of all conservation authorities in Ontario. So just a couple of words at the bottom of the screen here is that conservation authorities provide local programs that suit the local needs, and this includes looking at the local impacts of climate change. The reason that we look at managing many of our natural assets and natural resources at a watershed scale is simply because we're looking at those features and facilities like wetlands and floodplains and so on. And it just seems to be an easier way to study them at the watershed scale, and especially now in terms of climate resiliency. For example, looking at the stormwater management services that they provide, flood attenuation, and so on. Now, Conservation Halton is approximately 1,000 square kilometers. It drains eventually to Lake Ontario through many surface water sources, creeks, drains, and so on, and even with our subsurface, the groundwater sources as well. And within our specific watershed, I'm going to focus on a project of interest with some details that will help tie many of the subject matter that we were talking about today. So let's focus on Grindstone Creek subwatershed. It is approximately 90 square kilometers. It is located partially within the municipalities of Burlington, Hamilton, and the upper tier, the Halton Region municipality. And it also drains to Lake Ontario. So just speaking again, a little bit more drilling into detail about how you can value and better look at the monetary value of climate resiliency. We've done a preliminary assessment of the Conservation Halton properties. These include our parks, our trails, and various other properties that we hold in terms of looking at the carbon stored and the carbon sequestered. So based on our preliminary estimates, the carbon stored ranges between 2.4 to 3.7 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. The carbon sequestered is over 8,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. In terms of a monetary value, to start to assign a monetary value to these services provided, by the natural assets, that is over $2.7 million per year. And so you can start to see the value in terms of an economic factor when you put a dollar value to these services. So now to hone in on the Grindstone Creek watershed, we are currently undertaking a natural asset management project. And the previous speakers have very nicely laid out the context and the definitions for natural infrastructure, green infrastructure, and natural assets. So just as a quick recap, natural assets are our wetlands, our forests, our floodplains, even our soils. The natural assets within our watershed that provide various services, including climate resiliency, and they fall within the natural infrastructure definition. This specific project conducted for Grindstone Creek is conducted through the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative, or the MNAI group, in partnership with Conservation Halton, the municipalities of Burlington and Hamilton, and also with the Royal Botanical Gardens and the Greenbelt Foundation. It is one of the first of its kind in Ontario. Through this project, we are identifying, we're understanding, and we're really quantifying the roles of natural assets as a component of different programs and services such as flood mitigation, stormwater management, and even water quality control. The next step is determine the costs and benefits that these natural assets provide to us compared to engineered assets. So for example, stormwater management ponds and so on as engineered assets. And so you can see from the picture on the right-hand side, there are 4 main steps within which there are several studies and components, of course. And the very first one is to inventory the natural assets within the watershed and conduct some assessments. Those assessments are conditions assessments and risk assessments. The risk assessment piece is where we look at the impacts of climate change on the natural assets. The second step is service evaluation. We use a lot of modeling to get to determining the services offered by our natural assets. So for example, does a wetland provide flood mitigation services? What is the monetary value of that provided? What is an engineered asset equivalent for that service provided by a wetland? So the second step is where we get to that. And I also just covered the third step to indicate the monetary value provided, of course, through the economic valuation. And last but definitely not least is incorporating natural assets into the built infrastructure asset management plan. So definitely bringing together the worlds of natural infrastructure and built infrastructure through asset management plans. This picture here is a dashboard developed by the MNAI group, the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative group, specifically for this Grindstone Creek Natural Asset Project. And as you can see, the different natural assets are built. There's a lot of data that has gone behind showing this specific dashboard. There are the different land use types and natural asset types and the subcategories. So for example, agriculture, forested areas, wetlands, and so on. And then within the wetlands, we're looking at the subcategories, marsh and swamps and so on. So there's definitely a lot that goes behind the scenes to creating a natural asset inventory, which is the first step to getting to the economic valuation side of things. So drilling a little bit deeper to bring together all of the really good concepts and discussions that we've had so far, is applying modeling studies. So a specific model called PC-SWIM was used to look at the stormwater management services provided by these natural assets. And we looked at different scenarios within the modeling to get at the information that we wanted to derive. We looked at the existing natural assets, replacing those with simply bare earth. So no wetland as an example, or no forested area, simply replacing it with bare earth. And then also replacing the natural assets with engineered assets, such as stormwater management ponds. Also factoring in low impact development, so for example, bioswales. And then the last scenario is applying a climate change lens to several of these scenarios that are listed here. So looking at a 100-year storm event, for example. So with these scenarios, they helped us to get at the costing or the economic valuation side of things, and definitely assigning a monetary value to the services that are provided by our natural assets. These are compared to the costs of having the equivalents in terms of engineered assets and low impact development features. Now we slice and dice the costing, and we have some preliminary results, which hopefully we'll be able to share in the next couple of months. But at the end of the day, a cost per area is estimated to derive the monetary value. So far from our modeling results, the preliminary results are showing that there's definitely an enhanced infiltration rate by the forested areas compared to other natural and built infrastructure, even where there are climate change scenarios applied. So where we have forced heavy storm events on the natural assets and the built infrastructures, the forested areas are coming out as providing an enhanced infiltration rate. There's also increased benefits shown in the preliminary results when you combine natural assets with low impact development. So definitely stay tuned for our final reports, which is going to come out at the end of 2020. I'm going to reiterate also the other key benefits on our last slide here. And this has come up in the other presentations. So there are a lot of benefits that in some cases are difficult to quantify. And those could be water quality, climate mitigation, habitat provisions, recreation, and also on the qualitative side, the Indigenous values and all of the services provided to Indigenous communities and what they derive from it as well, and also the health and mental impact benefits. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chitra, for your presentation and highlighting how natural asset management helps achieve benefits such as wildlife habitat and biodiversity conservation, stormwater management, and carbon sequestration. It's really appreciated. Thank you so much. So now that we've completed the first section of our webinar, we'll move into the roundtable discussion with all of our speakers. For audience members, if you have any questions, I don't see any posted just yet, so please start submitting them if you do have them, and I'll get to them shortly. For the roundtable discussion, I will pose one prepared question to each speaker, and of course, all speakers are welcome to participate in the discussion. So for my first question, it will be to Sage. How close do you feel investment in natural capital is becoming mainstream?
Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, it's a good question and probably is at the core of why F4B exists today, because that's essentially our goal, right? To make sure that it's mainstream and there's the financial flows needed going towards these types of very important projects. So it's exciting because I think that we're just at the precipice in a lot of different areas where this is going to start seeing a tipping point towards large scale natural capital moving to these types of asset valuations. One of the things that I talked about was sort of the TNFD work, which is, I think, a really good indicator for what is coming forward because of, I think, the growing awareness and concern for financial institutions to really get out in front of this and understand what they need to do to evaluate this. And as soon as those things start to happen, that's when you'll see the waterfall effects of standardizations coming forward across global markets and being implemented in hopefully a much more mainstream way. So attention is being paid to it, it's coming, but I think we just really need to get at those core questions that are actively being discussed worldwide about how we standardize this in a way that can be understood and meaningful in a uniform way across global supply chains and markets.
I totally agree. Thank you so much, Sage. So to my second question, to Sean, do you believe natural capital accounting could inform financial decision making?
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. That's a great question. You know, and I think the short answer is yes. You know, inform financial decision making. You know, I think of that in terms of decision making for government, for businesses, for non-government organizations. So you know, yes, I think it is. I think we're seeing that with government at all levels, that there is an increased investment in natural infrastructure funding. I think as natural capital accounting matures, it will continue to drive that funding. You know, there are lots of examples of accounting for natural capital, and I think some of the issues around this is, you know, landing on one form of that. So there, I mean, there are there's lots of research that's been done on quantifying the, you know, the value of benefits of natural infrastructure, and it has, you know, you can apply those numbers to different financial accounting, but I think there needs to be an agreed upon you know, accounting for this in the sense of, you know, like carbon accounting. We can account for these other benefits that nature provides us. And these are, you know, I also sort of view this as a, you know, the hard costs versus soft costs. And, you know, I view hard costs as implementing natural infrastructure projects. And it's easier to put a price tag or to account for those costs because they're really, you know, direct costs for construction, for land acquisition, these kind of things. You can put a price on that, and you know, and groups do that. I mean, in terms of offsetting and compensation projects, we see across different provinces across Canada, across the world, who will put the price on offsets in terms of ratios and how much it would cost to lose a particular piece of nature, and to account for that. The soft costs, I see as you know, putting a price tag on the value of water quality, on the value of flood attenuation, value of carbon, these kind of things. And you know, the science is getting a lot better around that, and I think we're going to see some strong accounting cases continue to come forward that will really continue to drive the decision-making process.
Thank you so much, Sean. Over to Jen. Do you think that the finance sector should focus on preservation, restoration, or both at the same time?
Thanks. Yeah, another great question. I think my short answer would be definitely both. You know, any infrastructure investments are long-term investments that are going to have implications for, you know, years and decades to come, and particularly with green and natural infrastructure, where, you know, living things, it can take years for them to realize their full benefits. And so I think it's really important to protect what we've got and not risk losing more, you know, assets and services and benefits while we're also restoring damaged ecosystems, damaged assets. And then the other piece of that is really investing in building more or implementing more green infrastructure, particularly in urban environments where, you know, it's not just a matter of restoring, but it's really, you know, putting back new green infrastructure where it's been, you know, long lost and paved over. And so really bringing all three of those pieces together, I think, is critical. And yeah, something that we really certainly advocate for in funding. You know, there are gaps, I think, around being able to fund sort of the long-term thriving of some current assets that, you know, need a little more care. When you start talking about things like urban trees or rain gardens, certainly even wetlands, like, need a little time to establish. And so funding that supports all of the phases of the green infrastructure life cycle, I think, is really critical.
Thank you for pointing that out. That's very helpful. Thanks, Jen. On to our next question for Chitra. How can the focus on carbon be leveraged by the finance sector to benefit ecosystem restoration?
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. So certainly this is going to be somewhat of a new area that we're going into. Definitely not in its infancy, but there's lots of conversations going on around how we can better value and look at the service provided by natural infrastructure and get the finance sector involved. There are a few good examples out there. I am actually going to bring up one that's on the Carolinian Canada in one of their reports actually, and it's one in the United States that came up in 2016. The municipal authority there issued an environmental impact bond, and the proceeds of that bond will be used to fund green infrastructure projects. This is one example of where there's a model that's being put into place for pay for performance or a payment for ecosystem services. Now, going back to the finance sector, definitely there's a far more heavier emphasis on carbon, GHG emissions and the services provided by natural infrastructure for carbon sequestration and carbon storage. So there are a few risk assessments and also economic valuation steps that have to happen before we can actually solidify that. But definitely with the discussions going on around insurance, having a better grasp on the actual value provided by natural assets is key to that whole conversation. I would say that we are well underway, especially with some of these things that are coming up, which are based on the payment for ecosystem services type of model, Catherine.
Thank you so much, and I'm really happy that you brought up the Carolinian Canada bond. We actually had them, for those who are attending this webinar, who were on the webinar this morning at 10 a.m. We had members from Carolinian Canada discussing their impact bonds. So when these webinars the recordings are up, please feel free to watch the previous webinar, and it will offer some more information on that impact bond. Thank you so much. So Bridget, next question to you. What is needed to bring together more private and public investment to restore ecosystems?
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. And I don't want to repeat everything that all the other speakers already said, but in thinking about this question, I think we invest in the things that are important to us, and so I do think this process starts with valuing nature and natural assets, as so many of the speakers here today mentioned and discussed at length. And then where insurance comes in is really, I think, in several ways, but upfront by helping to de-risk these investments, which can help lower the cost of capital when investors are making these decisions, and then protecting that investment over time so that our natural assets are made more resilient to the extreme weather events that we're seeing almost on a daily basis now. So, we know they'll happen, we just don't know when. And so insurance helps us to be prepared for that, make sure those investments are made financially resilient, and then ultimately, I'm excited about the role that it plays in helping to incentivize further restoration of ecosystems and mitigation.
I totally agree. I think it's that incentivizing that behavior change is really important. So thanks so much, Bridget. Yeah. Last but not least, over to Joanna. And I do see some audience questions coming in, so I will flip to those in just a second. But I did want to ask Joanna, with the launch of the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, the TNFD, what are your hopes a task force like this could contribute to preserving natural assets?
So yeah, thanks for that question. So the Intech Center on the forum for the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, and I think it's a risk management tool, right? So it's basically like the TCFD disclosing nature-related risks on financial forms as kind of additional notes, as is currently done for climate-related risks. So I think that has a place in preventing further degradation of natural assets. But what we need to do is restore natural assets and create benefits and value those benefits. So I think one of the concerns I have at the moment is that there's a current focus on ESG, environmental being the E in ESG. But there's also, that is moving very fast in a non-standardized way, and that we can't really see what's being rated, versus accounting standards, which are very slowly evolving and are highly standardized. So I think for me, I think TNFD definitely has a role to play for limiting further damage. But I think what I would like to see is some way of reflecting the real value of natural assets on our financial statements, so that this is upfront and we can actually see the return on investment in these assets.
So now, actually, that I have you here, I do have a question from an audience member. Now, I think this is, you're not going to have an exact value. So the question is, what would you estimate as the total value of the Earth's natural services before humanity's impact? So it's a very abstract question. But I think it's key from that we're looking at this from an environmental, a social, and an economic perspective, that just a dollar value isn't necessarily even valuing it properly.
Yeah, and I think that's, you know, we're not going to come up with a perfect, precise answer of how much is nature worth. I mean, really, it's not that easy. But we can provide a good approximation. And I think the problem is that the error is of leaving it out is pretty much the biggest error you can make. Like, you can't get more of an error in your calculation than not making the calculation at all, so it's worth 0 when you know that it's worth something. So I think, you know, countries like the UK have been publishing natural capital accounts since 2014. They first had a go at it. So I think there are leaders in this area, and in Canada we really kind of need to focus on this and make a move to start down the road of really valuing the assets, because if we don't, we're consistently making the error of assuming that they're worth nothing.
From our previous webinar earlier this morning, really just highlighting that Canada is basically doing moderate in regards to the US, the EU, and China. So Joanna, thank you so much. Bridget, I have another question for you from the audience. How would you invest added premiums related to the impacts due to climate change?
I'm sorry, so can you repeat that? You said added premiums to climate change?
Yeah, so how would you invest added premiums related to the impacts due to climate change?
I think what they're asking is how are you incorporating additional premiums due to climate change? Is that, oh, you're muted, but.
I would assume so, yeah.
Yeah, so I would say, I mean, it's, you know, insurance comes down to, when you look at determining the price or the cost of the premium for an insurance policy, it comes down to the probability of the event occurring, as well as the value of the asset, or how exposed it is. And so with climate change, and as I mentioned in the presentation, this is something Swiss Re's been seeing on our balance sheet for decades, since the 70s. Kind of been Swiss Re's really been a loud voice in saying, you know, this is real, this is happening. We're seeing increasing severity and frequency of these types of events, and so it's inherently embedded in the calculation of premiums on an annual basis, or however long a policy is. And that's something that I hope wakes up policymakers and decision makers as well, because you know, for example, wildfires, you know, Swiss Re holds is the largest holder of wildfire risk in California. And in recent years, we've really stepped away from wanting to cover that risk. And that's because it's become so enormous, and it's happening more frequently at a more severe level. And so I think that insurance, as a, you know, putting that price tag on the risk really sends that loud signal. You know, if insurers are not willing to take the risk, then hey, we society should really do something to mitigate it and protect ourselves, because it's getting out of control. And so, you know, I think climate change is inherently embedded in our models and therefore the pricing of policies.
I think that's a really good point. I also think that the insurance industry has really driven action in regards to climate change because they were getting impacted first. They're the proxy for everyone else. They're not the only industry sector being impacted, but they can calculate their losses very quickly and show those losses. So I think the insurance industry is definitely a leader in that respect. So thanks so much.
Yeah.
Sage, I'm going to pose the next question to you. How do you sell to the public that nature services have monetary value?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, this isn't necessarily something that I touched on in my presentation, but the comment just instantly brought this to mind. You know, one piece of the puzzle that F4B is really keen on focusing on is the idea of just individual public action in this space. So I think that there's sort of two pieces to encouraging that there's value within the public sector on this. So there's public sector in terms of governmental entities and showing that there's, you know, real value. And I think too, you know, talking about the insurance angle, yes, insurance sort of sees this very upfront on their balance sheet, but if you're talking about public sector, I mean, if you take California, for example, you know, the public sector and governments are essentially bearing the brunt of a lot of these like public assets damages. So they are in a way an insurer, and the more they have to deal with very large damage bills at the end of these natural disasters as impacted by climate change, that becomes a harder burden for them to bear, and they recognize the value of these assets to mitigate some of these disasters. So that's one thing. The second thing that I didn't necessarily discuss, but I think is quite interesting, especially as we move into a more, you know, digital age where there's a really big digital economy and a lot of awareness around nature and biodiversity and the importance of it, is just individual engagement in this. So there's a lot of interesting initiatives that are creating effectively like unregulated markets for carbon, which is not necessarily what we're talking about here, but is assigning value and essentially drawing millions of people in to support the recognition and value and trade of things like, you know, carbon markets. And then you see all of these things already existing and just integration into systems where people can actually, you know, purchase carbon credits to offset their behavior. So it's things like that that are starting to build up, and using communication tools and slowly starting to show recognition that nature is part of that discussion and hand in hand with that discussion, and you can't actually reach those goals without nature being a part of that equation, is really important. And I think that there are some really positive steps that are coming through on both sides of that public sector communication and engagement for generating value.
So now that I actually have you, I do have another question. And again, the question is, what's the current value of ESG? And I don't expect you to have an actual value, but I think the latter question is more important. How much are leaders willing to pay for ESG kind of information and assets?
Yeah, and I mean, this is the tricky part of it, right? Because there is, I think, the valid criticism that people aren't willing to pay extra for this information, because the whole point of, I think, a lot of what's been discussed is, yes, there is the soft value for nature, and yes, we need to be finding ways where we can create the sort of, you know, what is the value now of something that's going to be generating massive services for us in 20, 30 years. But it's if you're thinking about it, unlocking this massive amount of capital as quickly as possible, you really need to be approaching this from what I like to characterize as, how can we make this as absolutely mundane and boring as possible? So when you're talking about these things to people and you reference debt markets and tax incentives and insurance frameworks, you start to see people's eyes glaze over, because this is just a normal part of the discussion. And ultimately, that's what I think we're aiming for, right? Because I absolutely agree that there's probably a really low tolerance from governments or private sectors to pay extra for additional data generation. But what we're discussing, I think, is talking about how you can actually align the data that is being gathered in a way that is supportive of financial mechanisms and actually drawing that tangible materiality of nature on the balance sheets within these organizations. So they're not actually paying for extra or doing more. It's just creating that implicit argument within current frameworks.
Thank you so much, Sage. That's very helpful. We have one final question from the audience, and I'm going to pose it to Joanna. And then at that point, I'll close off the webinar. But Joanna, what efforts are being made to standardize approaches to quantifying outputs, carbon sequestration, stormwater mitigation from natural assets conservation and or restoration? And I can reword that. I'm just kind of reading word for word. So
as I mentioned in my presentation, a lot of municipalities are going ahead with making their valuations of their natural assets, and but different bodies are being involved across the country in those valuation studies. So we mentioned MNAI in Quebec. Uranus has also been very active in this space, as well as Jérôme Duprat and his team, who are also working in Quebec and beyond. So I think that's the million-dollar question, is that we need standardization of how we are doing this so that we can kind of provide consistent data. And in a way, consistent data can be more valuable than correct data, because it provides a level playing field across the country, or we can take into account kind of slight regional differences also. But one example of this that I'm just writing about in a report actually is in the UK, when the government is dishing out funds for flood and erosion protection, there's a dollar value for every acre or hectare of coastal habitat that you create or kilometer of river that you restore. And those dollar values are not necessarily precise, but they basically make it so that everybody's playing on a level playing field, so that, and there is a value assigned to those ecosystems. So I think that's something to consider and into the future, and hopefully what we will be working on with the Public Sector Accounting Board.
That's awesome, Joanna. Thank you so much, and I think a great place to end. So as we are coming to the end of the webinar, I would like to take this opportunity to send my sincere thanks to each of our participants today. Your expert knowledge offered a lot of information on the need to invest in natural infrastructure, as well as solutions on how public sector accounting could reflect monetary value of natural assets in Canada. So I really thank you all very much for your time. As this is the last webinar of the Ontario Biodiversity Summit webinar series, which started in late May of this year, I would also like to take the opportunity to thank all speakers, panelists, hosts, and moderators, as well as all those running things in the back end of the system, for all of your efforts in organizing these webinars, and especially to our session attendees. Thank you for attending. A special thanks to the Invasive Species Centre, who hosted the webinar series on behalf of the Ontario Biodiversity Council. We could not have done it without any of you. We'll be posting today's webinar on the Ontario Biodiversity website, as well as our YouTube channel, together with all the other webinars, should anyone wish to review them. We'll also be posting a brief video on closing remarks to the summit, outlining the urgency for action, the need to follow through with priority actions identified in the summit, and next steps, the renewal of Ontario's biodiversity strategy through to 2030. Stay tuned, as we have a lot more work to do to implement nature-based solutions to protect what sustains us and to achieve a nature-positive world. Thank you all so much for attending, and have a great day.